Capital, Volume 1. This independent recording by Andrew S. Reitenberg is public domain, both in content and in audio. Chapter 6. The Sale and Purchase of Labor Power. The change in value of the money which has to be transformed into capital cannot take place in the money itself, since in its function as a means of purchase and payment it does no more than realize the price of the commodity it buys or pays for, while, when it sticks to its own peculiar form, it petrifies into a mass of value of constant magnitude. Just as little can this change originate in the second act of circulation, the resale of the commodity, for this act merely converts the commodity from its natural form back into its money form. The change must therefore take place in the commodity which is bought in the first act of circulation, M to C, but not in its value, for it is equivalents which are being exchanged, and the commodity is paid for at its full value. The change can therefore originate only in the actual use value of the commodity, i.e. in its consumption. In order to extract value out of the consumption of a commodity, our friend the money owner must be lucky enough to find within the sphere of circulation, on the market, a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value, whose actual consumption is therefore itself an objectification of labor, hence a creation of value. The possessor of money does find such a special commodity on the market, the capacity for labor, in other words, labor power. We mean by labor power, or labor capacity, the aggregate of those mental and physical capabilities existing in the physical form, the living personality of a human being, capabilities which he sets in motion whenever he produces a use value of any kind. But in order that the owner of money may find labor power on the market as a commodity, various conditions must first be fulfilled. In and for itself, the exchange of commodities implies no other relations of dependence than those which result from its own nature. On this assumption, labor power can appear on the market as a commodity only if and in so far as its possessor, the individual whose labor power it is, offers it for sale, or sells it as a commodity. In order that its possessor may sell it as a commodity, he must have it at his disposal. He must be the free proprietor of his own labor capacity, hence of his person. He and the owner of money meet in the market, and enter into relations with each other on a footing of equality as owners of commodities, with the sole difference that one is a buyer, the other a seller. Both are therefore equal in the eyes of the law. For this relation to continue, the proprietor of labor power must always sell it for a limited period only, for if he were to sell it in a lump once and for all, he would be selling himself, converting himself from a free man into a slave, from an owner of a commodity into a commodity. He must constantly treat his labor power as his own property, his own commodity, and he can do this only by placing it at the disposal of the buyer, i.e., handing it over to the buyer for him to consume for a definite period of time temporarily. In this way, he manages both to alienate his labor power and to avoid renouncing his rights of ownership over it. The second essential condition which allows the owner of money to find labor power in the market as a commodity is this, that the possessor of labor power, instead of being able to sell commodities in which his labor has been objectified, must rather be compelled to offer for sale as a commodity that very labor power which exists only in his living body. In order that a man may be able to sell commodities other than his labor power, he must of course possess means of production, such as raw materials, instruments of labor, etc. No boots can be made without leather. He requires also the means of subsistence. Nobody, not even a practitioner of Zukunftsmusik, can live on the products of the future, or on use values whose production has not yet been completed. Just as on the first day of his appearance on the world stage, man must still consume every day, before and while he produces. If products are produced as commodities, they must be sold after they have been produced, and they can only satisfy the producer's need after they have been sold. The time necessary for sale must be counted as well as the time of production. For the transformation of money into capital, therefore, the owner of money must find the free worker available on the commodity market, and this worker must be free in the double sense that as a free individual he can dispose of his labor power as his own commodity, and that, on the other hand, he has no other commodity for sale, i.e., he is rid of them. He is free of all the objects needed for the realization of his labor power. Why this free worker confronts him in the sphere of circulation is a question which does not interest the owner of money, for he finds the labor market in existence as a particular branch of the commodity market. And for the present, it interests us just as little. We confine ourselves to the fact theoretically, as he does practically. One thing, however, is clear. Nature does not produce on the one hand owners of money or commodities, and on the other hand men possessing nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no basis in natural history, nor does it have a social basis common to all periods of human history. It is clearly the result of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older formations of social production. The economic categories already discussed similarly bear a historical imprint. Definite historical conditions are involved in the existence of the product as a commodity. In order to become a commodity, the product must cease to be produced as the immediate means of subsistence of the producer himself. Had we gone further and inquired under what circumstances all or even the majority of products take the form of commodities, we should have found that this only happens on the basis of one particular mode of production, the capitalist one. Such an investigation, however, would have been foreign to the analysis of commodities. The production and circulation of commodities can still take place even though the great mass of the objects produced are intended for the immediate requirements of their producers, and are not turned into commodities, so that the process of social production is as yet by no means dominated in its length and breadth by exchange value. The appearance of products as commodities requires a level of development of the division of labor within society such that the separation of use value from exchange value, a separation which first begins with barter, has already been completed. But such a degree of development is common to many economic formations of society, with the most diverse historical characteristics. If we go on to consider money, its existence implies that a definite stage in the development of commodity exchange has been reached. The various forms of money as the mere equivalent of commodities, money as means of circulation, money as means of payment, money as hoard, or money as world currency, indicate very different levels of the process of social production, according to the extent and relative preponderance of one function or the other. Yet we know by experience that a relatively feeble development of commodity circulation suffices for the creation of all of these forms. It is otherwise with capital. The historical conditions of its existence are by no means given with the mere circulation of money and commodities. It arises only when the owner of the means of production and subsistence finds the free worker available on the market as the seller of his own labor power. And this one historical precondition comprises a world's history. Capital, therefore, announces from the outset a new epoch in the process of social production. This peculiar commodity, labor power, must now be examined more closely. Like all other commodities, it has a value. How is that value determined? The value of labor power is determined, as in the case of every other commodity, by the labor time necessary for the production and consequently also the reproduction of this specific article. Insofar as it has value, it represents no more than a definite quantity of the average social labor objectified in it. Labor power exists only as a capacity of the living individual. Its production consequently presupposes his existence. Given the existence of the individual, the production of labor power consists in his reproduction of himself or his maintenance. For his maintenance, he requires a certain quantity of the means of subsistence. Therefore, the labor time necessary for the production of labor power is the same as that necessary for the production of those means of subsistence. In other words, the value of labor power is the value of the means of subsistence necessary for the maintenance of its owner. However, labor power becomes a reality only by being expressed. It is activated only through labor. But in the course of this activity, i.e. labor, a definite quantity of human muscle, nerve, brain, etc. is expended, and these things have to be replaced. Since more is expended, more must be received. If the owner of labor power works today, tomorrow he must again be able to repeat the same process in the same conditions as regards health and strength. His means of subsistence must therefore be sufficient to maintain him in his normal state as a working individual. His natural needs, such as food, clothing, fuel, and housing, vary according to the climatic and other physical peculiarities of his country. On the other hand, the number and extent of his so-called necessary requirements, as also the manner in which they are satisfied, are themselves products of history, and depend, therefore, to a great extent on the level of civilization attained by a country. In particular, they depend on the conditions in which, and consequently on the habits and expectations with which, the class of free workers has been formed. In contrast, therefore, with the case of other commodities, the determination of the value of labor power contains a historical and moral element. Nevertheless, in a given country at a given period, the average amount of the means of subsistence necessary for the workers is a known datum. The owner of labor power is mortal. If then his appearance in the market is to be continuous, and the continuous transformation of money into capital assumes this, the seller of labor power must perpetuate himself in the way that every living individual perpetuates himself, by procreation. The labor power withdrawn from the market by wear and tear, and by death, must continually be replaced by, at the very least, an equal amount of fresh labor power. Hence the sum of the means of subsistence necessary for the production of labor power must include the means necessary for the worker's replacements, i.e. his children, in order that this race of peculiar commodity owners may perpetuate its presence on the market. In order to modify the general nature of the human organism in such a way that it acquires skill and dexterity in a given branch of industry and becomes labor power of a developed and specific kind, a special education or training is needed, and this in turn costs an equivalent in commodities of a greater or lesser amount. The costs of education vary according to the degree of complexity of the labor power required. These expenses, exceedingly small in the case of ordinary labor power, form a part of the total value spent in producing it. The value of labor power can be resolved into the value of a definite quantity of the means of subsistence. It therefore varies with the value of the means of subsistence, i.e., with the quantity of labor time required to produce them. Some of the means of subsistence, such as food and fuel, are consumed every day, and must therefore be replaced every day. Others, such as clothes and furniture, last for longer periods and need to be replaced only at longer intervals. Articles of one kind must be bought or paid for every day, others every week, others every quarter, and so on. But in whatever way the sum total of these outlays may be spread over the year, they must be covered by the average income, taking one day with another. If the total of the commodities required every day for the production of labor power equals A, and of those required every week equals B, and of those required every quarter equals C, and so on, the daily average of these commodities equals 365 times A, plus 52 times B, plus 4 times C, etc., over 365. Suppose that this mass of commodity required for the average day contains 6 hours of social labor, then every day half a day of average social labor is objectified in labor power, or in other words, half a day of labor is required for the daily production of labor power. This quantity of labor forms the value of a day's labor power, or the value of the labor power reproduced every day. If half a day of average social labor is present in 3 shillings, then 3 shillings is the price corresponding to the value of a day's labor power. If its owner therefore offers it for sale at 3 shillings a day, its selling price is equal to its value, and according to our original assumption, the owner of money, who is intent on transforming his 3 shillings into capital, pays this value. The ultimate or minimum limit of the value of labor power is formed by the value of the commodities which have to be supplied every day to the bearer of labor power, the man, so that he can renew his life process. That is to say, the limit is formed by the value of the physically indispensable means of subsistence. If the price of labor power falls to this minimum, it falls below its value, since under such circumstances it can be maintained and developed only in a crippled state, and the value of every commodity is determined by the labor time required to provide it in its normal quality. It is an extraordinarily cheap kind of sentimentality which declares that this method of determining the value of labor power, a method prescribed by the very nature of the case, is brutal, and which laments with Rossi in this matter. Quote, "To conceive capacity for labor, in abstraction from the worker's means of subsistence during the production process, is to conceive a phantom. When we speak of labor, or capacity for labor, we speak at the same time of the worker and his means of subsistence, of the worker and his wages." End quote. When we speak of capacity for labor, we do not speak of labor any more than we speak of digestion when we speak of capacity for digestion. As is well known, the latter process requires something more than a good stomach. When we speak of capacity for labor, we do not abstract from the necessary means of subsistence. On the contrary, their value is expressed in its value. If his capacity for labor remains unsold, this is of no advantage to the worker. He will rather feel it to be a cruel nature-imposed necessity that his capacity for labor has required for its production a definite quantity of the means of subsistence, and will continue to require this for its reproduction. Then, like Sismondi, he will discover that the capacity for labor is nothing unless it is sold. One consequence of the peculiar nature of labor power as a commodity is this, that it does not in reality pass straight away into the hands of the buyer on the conclusion of the contract between buyer and seller. Its value, like that of every other commodity, is already determined before it enters into circulation, for a definite quantity of social labor has been spent on the production of the labor power. But its use value consists in the subsequent exercise of that power. The alienation of labor power and its real manifestation, i.e., the period of its existence as a use value, do not coincide in time. But in those cases in which the formal alienation by sale of the use value of a commodity is not simultaneous with its actual transfer to the buyer, the money of the buyer serves as means of payment. In every country where the capitalist mode of production prevails, it is the custom not to pay for labor power until it has been exercised for the period fixed by the contract, for example, at the end of each week. In all cases, therefore, the worker advances the use value of his labor power to the capitalist. He lets the buyer consume it before he receives payment of the price. Everywhere, the worker allows credit to the capitalist. That this credit is no mere fiction is shown not only by the occasional loss of the wages the worker has already advanced when a capitalist goes bankrupt, but also by a series of more long-lasting consequences. Whether money serves as a means of purchase or a means of payment, this does not alter the nature of the exchange of commodities. The price of labor power is fixed by the contract, although it is not realized till later, like the rent of a house. The labor power is sold, although it is paid for only at a later period. It will therefore be useful, if we want to conceive the relation in its pure form, to presuppose for the moment that the possessor of labor power, on the occasion of each sale, immediately receives the price stipulated in the contract. We now know the manner of determining the value paid by the owner of money to the owner of this peculiar commodity, labor power. The use value which the former gets in exchange manifests itself only in the actual utilization, in the process of the consumption of the labor power. The money owner buys everything necessary for this process, such as raw material, in the market, and pays the full price for it. The process of the consumption of labor power is at the same time the production process of commodities and of surplus value. The consumption of labor power is completed, as in the case of every other commodity, outside the market or sphere of circulation. Let us therefore, in company with the owner of money and the owner of labor power, leave this noisy sphere, where everything takes place on the surface and in full view of everyone, and follow them into the hidden abode of production, on whose threshold there hangs the notice, "No admittance except on business." Here we shall see, not only how capital produces, but how capital is itself produced. The secret of profit-making must at last be laid bare. The sphere of circulation or commodity exchange, within whose boundaries the sale and purchase of labor power goes on, is in fact a very Eden of the innate rights of man. It is the exclusive realm of freedom, equality, property, and bentham. Freedom, because both buyer and seller of a commodity, let us say of labor power, are determined only by their own free will. They contract as free persons who are equal before the law. Their contract is the final result in which their joint will finds a common legal expression. Equality, because each enters into a relation with the other, as with a simple owner of commodities, and they exchange equivalent for equivalent. Property, because each disposes only of what is his own, and bentham, because each looks only to his own advantage. The only force bringing them together, and putting them into relation with each other, is the selfishness, the gain, and the private interest of each. Each pays heed to himself only, and no one worries about the others. And precisely for that reason, either in accordance with the pre-established harmony of things, or under the auspices of an omniscient providence, they all work together to their mutual advantage, for the common weal and in the common interest. When we leave this sphere of simple circulation or the exchange of commodities, which provides the free trader vulgaris with his views, his concepts, and the standard by which he judges the society of capital and wage labor, a certain change takes place, or so it appears, in the physiognomy of our dramatis personae. He who was previously the money owner now strides out in front as a capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to market and now has nothing else to expect but a tanning. End of part 2.